Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this fantastic setting, which many landlords ought to recognise in terms of time, even if they may not actually have visited this marvellous establishment before, because these buildings are actually probably the same vintage originally as much of the stock in the private rented sector, which explains in part why some 40% of the stock in the private rented sector is said to fall below decent homes standards. At least that is a partial explanation. But you do see around this building what can be done to an older Victorian building. But that's not my main theme. The question, where would we be without private landlords, is eminently clear. As Jake has just acknowledged, we would be in a powerless state for housing in this country. When we started off on the road of getting fully active with the National Landlords Association in public policy, we used to talk about there being 9 or 10 million tenancies in the private rented sector. Well, today it's something like 2.5 million, 2.4 is the estimate and rising. And it's accounting now for somewhere in the region of 15% of the nation's housing stock, according to the English Housing Survey. But I think possibly a more significant statistic even than that is the fact that, according again to the English Housing Survey, some 70% of new households that are being formed are in the private rented sector. So it is expanding, and it would seem to be increasingly the only option for an increasing number of people. If you are contemplating alternative forms of tenure, where do you see the expansion to take up the burgeoning demand? Do you see it in owner occupation? Well, I think you'd be a bit of an optimist if you think owner occupation is going to increase in this country, especially with the small matter of university tuition fees on the horizon and the demands that will put on the very people who are most likely to aspire to home ownership, namely the professional middle class. At the same time, the demand for social housing will increase, and yet the ability of society as a whole, energised by government, to provide more social housing is severely constrained, and how one can see a way around that particular problem at the moment is hard to see. Therefore, the demand is going to increase on the private rented sector. So what should we as a society, what indeed should government be doing about that situation? Well, the answer is most definitely not more regulation. It is not bearing down on private landlords. It is not introducing largely, arguably unnecessary localised directions forcing landlords into particular straitjackets. It is not introducing licensing schemes which carry with them egregiously high licensing fees, which entitle us to suspect that part of the motive for such schemes is revenue raising to help meet the straitened positions that many local authorities find themselves in. And yet the government, central government, is quite clear that fees must be set to cover the actual costs of introducing the scheme and not be regarded in any way as revenue raisers. But I don't wish to accuse all local authorities of doing that. Far from it. I'm talking about a minority who do. So therefore what we're talking about is incentivising private landlords, not controlling them, not directing, and not bearing down on them, and not regarding private landlords as part of the problem. We are not, as landlords, the problem. We are actually, in today's circumstances nationally, very much part of the solution. I do think there are some things that could be done. I enjoin DWP to look again at the possibility, however remote, of direct payments to landlords. Quite honestly, with the with the present movement towards this consolidated allowance, it is difficult to see how administratively it could be done. But at the risk of name dropping, I did say to Chris Grayling 3 nights ago, 3 evenings ago, that if somehow they could find a way of a presumption in favour of payment by the local authority to the landlord, rather than an automatic payment, but a presumption if their set of circumstances, set of criteria are met, then I believe that would be very helpful. And he nodded with a wise look on his face, as I know Chris Grayling is capable of doing, and I rather hope he will go back and consider that. The final point I wish to make is that local authorities are very much the instrument of government with whom landlords deal day to day, and local authorities are notoriously risk averse. They need to move away, be persuaded to move away from what I would characterize as a box ticking mentality to a more targeted means of enforcement in terms of a strategy, with a strategy to get after the rogue landlords, and for heaven's sake, local authorities, leave the reputable majority alone. We don't need to be in touch continually at public expense with officials, especially those of us who are members of the NLA and are accredited landlords. Over to you.
Thank you.